My name's Eric. I am the CEO of AIC Global Solutions. We are a transaction-agnostic closing platform, and with us you get the assurance of closing when you want, and very importantly, the way that you want. We handle asset trading, corporate finance, M&A, and special situations. We're based here in London, and we operate under English law. I am a recovering attorney. I'm admitted to practice in California, England and Wales, and France. I'm also a recovering banker, having worked on the business side to structure and execute on cross-border asset finance transactions. I'm currently the vice chair of the Sales and Acquisitions Committee of the European Business Aviation Association, and I've written a number of articles, including my personal favorite, which is titled, "The Cape Town Convention is Insidious. The United States should withdraw immediately." There we go. So let me start by saying that this presentation is a knowledge share that's designed to showcase the expertise that underlies our platform. And come and see me afterwards if you'd like to see on my smartphone how our solution handles a 9-figure transaction involving a foreign exchange play. A couple of years ago, in fact, at Super Yacht Investor, we started speaking with super yacht market participants to get a sense of whether this market had any interest or could use what we're offering as our solution. We were fortunate. Everyone we spoke with was candid. And we were grateful that they took the time to explain how the existing customs and practices work, and they consistently emphasized that a lot of time and money are at stake. And a message we also received is that yes, they really want a solution like ours to simplify and speed up closings while mitigating the risks of the loss of that time and money. Lawyers no longer want the conflicts of interest raised by those customs and practices. For example, the seller's attorney holding the buyer's funds. Lawyers no longer want the execution risk, because the fact is that the law firms are not really set up to deal with money quickly. And they no longer want the cost and burden that comes with administering deal closing logistics. Brokers, of course, work for years for a transaction to occur. It's a massive investment of time, energy, and money. They want a solution that reduces execution risk while helping transactions to close faster and with less friction. And the principals, of course, want the transaction to have been closed yesterday. And with that said, today I'd like to speak with you about reverse engineering cross-border transactions. And let me start by giving you the punchline on the practical considerations that can really impact a deal. It all starts with where are the parties located, because that's going to drive the logistical issues, such as time zones, languages, managing the paper, and rationalizing funds flows and addressing currency mismatches. So today I'd like you to think of this presentation as a conversation. And this presentation has 4 slides. We're going to talk about a core transaction, the overlay of asset movements, a proposed bolt-on transaction, and some practical considerations. What you are going to see is the following. You will see from slides 1 and 2 that the transactions issues focused very much on dealing with personality issues. Slides 3 and 4 are where the issues become more technical, and most importantly, simplify, simplify, simplify. Finally, as a byproduct of this presentation, you will understand, I think, better the risks that certain brokers and dealers take and why they're paid so much, and you will understand why good lawyers should be paid on an hourly basis. So this case study applies by analogy to your market because, like yachts, corporate aircraft are highly regulated capital equipment that can involve complex ownership, operating, and financing structures. Here, I'm going to talk about a particularly complicated transaction, which was a disclosed cross-border double back-to-back aircraft trade. Let me start by explaining the diagram. The vertical lines represent borders. The hashed arrows represent privity of contract and the funds flows. You've got 4 parties from 4 different places, 1 in the US, 2 in Europe, and 1 in Africa. You've got the aircraft, which is registered in a 5th, Bermuda. The commercial drivers for this transaction were that the end seller wanted to offload a pre-owned aircraft to make space for a new aircraft. The issue was that the end seller's behavior was perceived by the other transaction parties as being erratic, not entirely consistent with the deal logic. The double back-to-back advanced intermediary two's business interests, and yet it was unwilling to use its own liquidity to simplify the deal by taking out the end seller. Was intermediary two perhaps uncomfortable with the metal risk? Well, that's where intermediary one came into play, because it took the aircraft from intermediary two, and its money was the difference between the purchase prices in its 2 purchase agreements. The price agreed between intermediary one and the end buyer, backstop, of course, intermediary one's downside on the aircraft value, and the end buyer was well advised and agreed to a purchase price that left upside in the aircraft. Critically, the end buyer knew that it was providing the liquidity that would allow this complex transaction to occur. And of course, escrow was used. In this, what I'd like to do is start by describing the basic aircraft movements and then fill in the detail. Of course, the end seller would be using the aircraft wherever it wanted to up until the point at which it would go into pre-buy. At that time, it would fly to Switzerland where pre-buy would occur. Then, after pre-buy, the aircraft would be moved to the location where the transfer of title would occur. The original transfer of title closing structure was, of course, tax-driven. And what they would do is fly the aircraft from Switzerland to the UK to close in a customs warehouse. The benefit of a customs warehouse is that the sale is exempt from value-added tax, and initially, as structured, all of the legs of the back-to-back would close here in the UK. Now, as the transaction continued, intermediary two proposed a revised closing structure and that the aircraft would remain in Switzerland for closing. The reason for this was it was based on the aircraft movements. The aircraft was already going to be there for the pre-buy. The end seller's behavior had become increasingly erratic, and intermediary one had bolstered intermediary two's position because it had gotten to the point where it no longer wanted to pay to move the aircraft from Switzerland to the UK. The comfort offered was to rely on a tax opinion that, like an oral contract, was not worth the paper it was written on. The tax opinion was artificial. It papered over underlying facts, and some of the major issues included assumptions that covered conclusions as to other tax issues and processes that were germane to the value-added tax analysis. At the end of the day, what happened was that after 2 weeks of negotiation, they jettisoned the revised closing structure and continued to have the closing, or agreed to have the closing in the UK. Oh, there we go. So as the transaction continued, and it had been going on for quite some time at this point, both intermediaries began to suffer from deal fatigue. They both wanted to take out the end seller, and yet neither wanted to use its own liquidity to do so. In addition, intermediary two wanted its net sale proceeds to hit its account simultaneously with the sale of the aircraft to intermediary one. For this reason, this structure was very much an accommodation to intermediary two. The way it worked was that the end buyer would advance a secured loan to intermediary 1. Intermediary 1 would use those proceeds to close in Switzerland with intermediary 2, who simultaneously would close with the end seller. The aircraft would then fly to the UK, where the closing with the end buyer would occur. This structure raised a whole host of commercial and legal issues, and in this case, it was critical to resolve the commercial issues because they would drive the legal issues. And the commercial issues were essentially: 1, why can't intermediary 2 forego the receipt of the net sale proceeds to allow the balance of the transaction to close smoothly? Don't forget, there was an escrow agent involved. And using an escrow agent means 2 things. A, as of closing, title of the funds would have transferred to intermediary 2 anyway. And B, it's therefore just a logistical exercise to get possession of the funds from the agent to intermediary 2. 2, why can't either intermediary tap into its liquidity to simplify the transaction? They were both substantial entities. 3, what is the collateral before intermediary 1 owns the aircraft? 4, what is the U.S. tax impact to the end buyer, the payment of interest and the repayment of the loan? Can they be structured to be a wash, or will there be a material tax impact? 5, is intermediary 2 willing to backstop intermediary 1's performance with respect to the end buyer? After all, remember, this was an accommodation to intermediary 2 that intermediary 1 was trying to sell to the end buyer. And 6, is intermediary 1 willing to pay the end buyer an arrangement fee and cover the end buyer's transaction expenses for the loan? Depending on the answers to those issues, these legal issues would then need to be considered. 1, will the end buyer trigger a financial regulatory licensing obligation in the US, Bermuda, Switzerland, or the UK if it advances a loan to intermediary 1? 2, will the end buyer trigger any corporate income tax payment or reporting obligations in any of those countries? 3, is there any withholding tax due on the payment of interest or on the payment of principal? And if so, what is it? 4, does the aircraft stay registered in Bermuda during intermediary 1's ownership? Can a U.S. creditor take security over a Bermuda registered aircraft? Where else does security need to be perfected? The UK, Switzerland, elsewhere in Europe? 5, could any of the authorities in any of these countries pierce the end buyer's veil to impose liability for any of these issues on the UBO? And 6, if they can, then what is the likelihood that they would in fact do so? Long story short, after roughly a couple of years of running through this transaction, the transaction fell apart. Now, you might think that this was because of counterparty behavior. It wasn't so. What ended up happening was that when the aircraft went into pre-buy, they discovered a very subtle engine issue that was expensive to repair, and then the transaction terminated. There we go. With respect to transactions, cross-border transactions, there are a lot of practical considerations that you have to think about. And from my perspective, it all really boils down to where are the parties located? Because as I said, that's going to drive languages, currencies, and time zones. With respect to currencies, obviously, is there a mismatch? And in addition, are you going to deal with exchange control issues? And with respect to exchange control issues, is there a shortage of foreign currency in that particular country that would make it impossible for the payer to utilize an exchange control approval to convert local currency to the deal currency? With time zones, we're talking about negotiation, signing, funding, release of documents, and of course, registrations and other filings. I think the next thing is what factors can influence behavior? well, the parties? Is it their legal system? Is it common law, where basically everything is permitted unless it's prohibited? Or is it civil law, where it's the other way around? Everything is prohibited unless a code expressly permits it. What is the approach to enforcement? Is it prescriptive, where there's basically a total mistrust of individual judgment? Or is it investigatory, where it is permissive of individual judgment? How do they interpret contracts? Is it textual, which is very similar to the UK and the US? Or is it teleological, ends-driven, which is what you typically find in civil law jurisdictions, which is why their contracts tend to be, from a UK, an English or an American perspective, quite short on the substance and quite long on the recitals. What's their economic worldview? Are they traditionally capitalist? Are they traditionally socialist? Were they communist? How does their government work? Is it grassroots or top-down? Because that's also going to impact how they deal with you. And of course, the documentation. How long, that's going to govern how long it takes you to do the deal. What are the primary transaction documents? What are the finance documents? And what else is ancillary to the deal that helps it get across the line? This is my disclaimer. All this says is, I hope I've been entertaining and you can't rely on anything I said. And I appreciate your time today, and I'd be happy to take any questions.
By all means, ask Eric some questions at lunch in the break.
Yeah.
That'd be great, yeah. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Cheers.